and we started with this idea called an extremist leadership, because good science starts with a good definition. So we conceived of leadership in much the same way as other places, giving people purpose, motivation, and direction. But we added in where followers believe that leader behavior will influence their physical well-being or survival. So the definition changed the context for us. And it also gave us the opportunity to measure what we are studying, because beliefs are measurable. I'm a social psychologist by training. We measure beliefs and attitudes all the time. So it's pretty easy to see how the science on this could develop. But it also meant that we were going to have to move into that new zone, into that context where followers believe that leader behavior would influence their physical well-being or survival. So I'm going to review very quickly for you 3 studies that we did in order to build some knowledge, to create knowledge in a scientific way about how people lead in dangerous contexts. And once I'm finished, I'm going to show you the framework. And I think you'll be interested in it. It's interesting just because it's a little unique to study this particular topic, but it's also a framework that informs crisis leadership very, very well. There are 2 ways that you can study crisis leadership to apply in the types of organizations where you work. The first way is to study business cases. So you study business cases where someone was doing business, they were thrust into this unanticipated crisis, and then by leading and taking action, they got out of their problem somehow. To me, that's like trying to learn how to play golf by watching amateurs knock it into the rough and then chip it back onto the fairway. It's not necessarily instructive in terms of the very best crisis leaders. And so the way that I've tried to study it is by looking at experts, looking at people who are in crisis all the time. What's their leadership style? How do they apply leadership? How do they influence people who are desperate? Whether the desperation comes from a fear of physical threat, or not their lives are threatened, but their livelihoods. Somebody who's worried about a business going down, somebody who's in a big financial and maybe losing $500 million. Serious business consequences. And so that's why we'll walk through this quickly, and I'll give you the framework, and then I'm going to tell you how we sort of innovated on the margin and moved it into West Point slowly. So the first study, I'll use this as representative. I went to Iraq with 3 other people, and we literally just took what we could carry on our backs, dressed in desert camouflage, on the planes headed over there, water, socks, tape recorders, ammunition, that's it. No logistic trail at all, no food even. We would have to borrow that from the people that we found in Iraq and who we talked to. And we went over there in April of 2003, and in early April of 2003 you saw on CNN soldiers fighting their way through these blinding sandstorms to get to Baghdad. And that's what we landed in the middle of, to go to combat and to talk to soldiers about what their leadership was like. And our emphasis began on followers. You know, you look at the leadership literature, probably 80% of it is focused on the leader, because researchers love to be around leaders. You know, they're important people, they're fun to talk to. But if you want to learn about leadership, particularly leadership under threat, then the follower perspective becomes very, very important, because the pressures of these circumstances make where you are on the wiring diagram a lot less important, and it's all about follower trust. And so we talked in Iraq to about 54 U.S. soldiers and Marines. This is where the Marines were actually. This is a palace called Hilla, which is south of Baghdad, and of significance because it overlooks the ruins of ancient Babylon. That's why Saddam built that palace there. We also talked to 36 Iraqi prisoners about their experience with their leaders in the context of the brief operations that they underwent, and then their surrender in combat. And we did that under charter from the Army Personnel Chief to look into morale and leadership in the Iraqi Army. So it was a combined military effort and a place where we could collect data. But obviously this kind of research doesn't go through a university IRB process. It's all military, so we weren't going to publish it in an academic journal, but we were able to publish it in a book later. The second study we did was with our sport parachute team. I've worked with the team for 9 years. It's 36 cadets, 12 per year for 3 years. And it's a fascinating team, and the way that we did this work is that we looked at team leadership across the military academy and interviewed 20 of the team captains from the NCAA sports teams that are there: baseball, softball, football, women's volleyball, diving, track, cross country, etc. And we compared all of the work that we did with them to the 10 most experienced cadets on the parachute team. And these young people, all of them about 20, 21 years old, all had more than 500 parachute jumps. They're all parachute instructors, licensed and certified. They'd all competed nationally. So for people their age, they were incredibly talented and experienced at this particular sport. And we compared those groups on how they led and so forth. And then the final study was more typical leader interview type study, where we brought 24 people to the academy and talked to them about how they lead in dangerous contexts. And there were 2 qualities or characteristics that got someone in the door as an in-extremis leader that we wanted to talk about. The first was that they had to be currently and actively leading people in dangerous contexts. So we didn't talk to anybody who used to do it. It was all people that at that time were taking people to dangerous places. So I'm talking about climbing guides who take people up Everest and K2 and dangerous climbs. We interviewed a woman who takes HD video teams into the tiger preserves in India and videotapes tigers on the ground. Interviewed the SWAT team chiefs from the New York and San Francisco offices of the FBI. Interviewed large formation skydiving organizers that put 300 or 400 people together in free fall to make world records. And there were 2 things that these people had in common. The first is that they, as I said, that they routinely worked in dangerous contexts. And the second was that they were experienced enough at it that somebody got killed on their watch. That they had had an incident or an accident where they were overcome by the context and somebody didn't go home. And we thought that using that as a baseline for who we would let in the door would get us a very unique and interesting population of individuals to talk to, and it did. So we took that material, the tapes from Iraq and other kinds of evidence. We boiled down the tapes in a classic sociological content analysis using coders, and we developed a framework on how we found leadership was different in contexts where the stakes were so high that people were afraid. They were just flat afraid. And this is the framework, and I'll just talk you through it quickly. I mean, I could talk about this for hours and hours, but just real quickly, we started out by discovering that competence becomes much more important, much more preeminent in these contexts in terms of developing and establishing trust than the more balanced, competent social interaction that we usually see in organizations. For example, when businesses come to West Point and they want to increase loyalty and develop trust in organizations, they do a lot of activities like playing golf together, going on a leader reaction course together. It's a lot of team building, social kinds of things, cocktail hours, what have you. But what we found is that socially based trust in dangerous contexts or in high-risk contexts goes away. I mean, it just almost evaporates, and all people care about is, can this leader get me through this crisis? Are they good enough to get us through? And I talked to Marines who were working for a guy who they said in garrison they could not stand, and they were not looking forward to eventually rotating back to the States and working for him back at their unit in the States. But that in combat, he was so competent at doing his job and at taking care of them that they all got together and put him in for the Marine Corps Medal of Valor. So the idea is that much of the leadership that we do in peacetime, the follower needs, what followers are looking for in their leaders, shifts. And that shift is towards competence. in these contexts. The second was a principle called inherent motivation that we uncovered when we asked the team captains and skydivers to rank order 9 leadership competencies in terms of their personal strengths. So these were classic competencies that all of you would be familiar with: decision-making, communicating, motivating, learning, and so forth. And among the ordinary teams that we talked to, the basketball players and rugby players and so forth, motivating was their number one competency by a wide margin. Very consistently, they would say that as team captains, they need to motivate. They need to motivate their team. Among the parachutists, motivating was second from the bottom of a list of 9. It was not even on their scope, even though these were basically the captains, the instructors, the people who were working with all those younger cadets. And when we dug into that, what we found is that when people are afraid, they're already fully aroused, and so they're very resistant to the usual kinds of leader motivation that we see in peacetime. They do not want a cheerleader. They do not want someone who walks into the room and lights everyone up. They want a very quiet, calm professional. And as we interviewed some of these people who are routinely in dangerous places, one of the things we noticed anecdotally is that they're all very quiet people. Very unassuming, very humble, quiet people. And when they walk into a room, they calm the room down. And the worse things get, the quieter they get. Not the more excited, because it's too easy to push people out of their stability zone, if you will. So that recognizing and teaching cadets to recognize that when things are going bad, it's not the time to do the Hollywood thing where you're yelling and screaming into a radio and grabbing people by their shirt, because that Hollywood director is trying to excite people in the audience. And in real context, what you have to do is calm people down. What was number one on these people's list? Number one was learning. That's what parachutists said was their number one competency as instructors, was learning. And when we drilled into that, what we were finding is an outward focus on the environment all the time, which allowed them to learn very, very rapidly, and also to spot things that might be out of place, things that might not be right. Because cadets, we use a helicopter for our operations, and they jump 5 or 6 days a week when the weather's good. And we do not always go up with them in the aircraft. Often that aircraft will go up and there are only cadets in there. And so they're checking their own parachute gear. They all pack their parachutes, their own parachutes. Even for their first jump, they pack their own parachutes. And so it's a vigilance task. And so that outward focus allows them to learn very rapidly. And someone recently said about crisis leadership, don't waste a good crisis. And we absolutely believe that based on this, because it allows an organization to focus intently on problems that are truly threatening them, and it gets everyone's attention focused, and it allows for breakthrough learning. The fourth outcome we found is this concept of shared risk, and it's ubiquitous in the military, the idea of leading from the front being important. But we view it as a broader concept where when leaders can communicate to the people who work for them that they're in the game, that they also have risk, that if the organization doesn't do well, it's not just going to be the rank and file that are going to pay the price in layoffs and other sorts of things, that it's a common threat, that builds trust. And consequently, or in addition, leaders who establish too much distance and don't share risk with their people are not trusted in crisis. And then lastly, a concept of common lifestyle. Dangerous places also have a tendency to be miserable places to be. And that's true when you have high risk in organizations and people are working 20 hours a day, where they're not getting regular meals, they're off their exercise schedule, and they're basically focused on the threat. Leaders have to share in that visibly. I mean, they have to visibly share in just the misery of crisis. Because if they don't, if they're not there at the hard times, again, trust starts to erode. People are kind of wondering where the boss is and why aren't they contributing to what we're doing. And it just underscores the nature of leadership as service.